The German Shepherd didn't move. He was curled tightly into himself, pressed into the farthest corner of the kennel as if the shadows there might hide him from the world. His head rested low between his paws, and his eyes, once bright, once sharp, stayed fixed on the concrete floor. He didn't lift them when footsteps echoed across the shelter. He didn't even blink. The man walked slowly, step after step, careful not to startle what could not be startled. The dog's fur, once thick and proud, had thinned and dulled, weighed down not only by dust and time, but by the heavy patience of waiting. His coat was tangled, rough to the touch, a reminder of days too long spent behind steel bars. The shelter was still that afternoon, quieter than usual. Even the faint hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to soften as if not to intrude. The staff stood nearby, not daring to move. Their faces were heavy with something between hope and sorrow. No one spoke. No one shifted. It was the kind of silence so fragile that even the smallest sound might break it apart. The man stopped just short of the bars. He was tall, his shoulders broad, though bent slightly with age, as though time itself had pressed him down little by little. He took in a breath that caught halfway in his throat. When his voice came, it rasped out dry and cracked, like an instrument unused for years trying to remember its tune. "Max." The sound carried across the stillness and landed. But the dog did not stir, not a twitch of an ear, not a flicker of an eye. Nothing. Max did not even lift his head. The silence thickened, stretching between them like a wall. What should have been a reunion began to ache like a test, a cruel one. Was it too late? Had time stolen too much? Even the air seemed to hesitate, holding itself back as if waiting. Then, barely there, something shifted. A flicker, a movement so small it could have been imagined. One ear tilted, cautious, unsure. And in that fragile sliver of motion, the man's tired eyes sparked to life with something long buried, something called hope. Before the quiet days, before the empty bowls and long walks alone, there had been a man named Elliot. He had lived by the rhythm of machines. For 35 years, he worked the same railway yard in Portland, a mechanic with grease under his nails, steam in his lungs, and the clang of steel echoing in his ears. He wasn't much for conversation. He didn't need to be. The younger men at the yard called him Old Rail. Some said it out of respect, some out of jest, but Elliot never minded. He came early, stayed late, fixed what was broken, and kept the trains running. Day after day, year after year. He was a man people recognized but did not really know. That was enough for him. His job was to keep things moving, wheels turning, engines breathing, schedules steady. While passengers looked out at a world flying by, Elliot stayed grounded beneath it all, unseen, holding the rhythm together, until one winter afternoon when he hung up his gloves for good. No speech, no gathering. Just silence, the kind that seeps deep into your bones when the noise you've always known falls away all at once. At first, he thought retirement would taste like freedom. Instead, it carried a heavier flavor: emptiness. So he packed what little mattered into the back of his old pickup, sold the rest, and left the city behind. He didn't know where he was going, only that it had to be quiet. A place where trees could replace the wires, where dirt roads replaced traffic, where silence felt less like a burden and more like a beginning. He found it in a small town tucked between fog and hills. Time moved slower there. People kept to themselves. No one asked questions. That was the place, and that was where everything began. It was near sunset when Elliot first saw him. The road had long since turned to gravel, winding through soft hills and whispering pines. He wasn't in a rush. He rarely was anymore. The silence outside matched the silence inside. Then, just before a bend, something by the edge of the woods caught his eye. At first, he thought it was nothing more than trash, maybe a tarp rolled tight, abandoned by careless campers. But the stillness was too alive. He slowed, heart pushing harder, not with fear but with recognition he couldn't quite explain. When he stepped out, the air smelled of damp moss and fallen leaves. The shape near the brush stirred, just faintly. And there it was, a young German shepherd, thin to the bone, fur tangled with burrs and dirt. One ear stood tall, the other drooped as if it had given up. His paws looked too big for his legs, his body caught between puppyhood and adulthood. His breathing was shallow but steady. One eye opened wider than the other, uncertain but alert. He didn't bark. He didn't run. He only looked up weakly and let his tail wag once, small, almost invisible. It wasn't joy. It wasn't excitement. It was only one message. "I'm trying." Elliot froze, unsure. Then, without a word, he opened the passenger door. The dog didn't move, so Elliot waited. Minutes slipped by, long enough for the sun to disappear behind the ridge. Finally, the shepherd rose slowly and climbed into the truck. No leash, no struggle, just an understanding. Elliot drove on with one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the seat, not touching but near enough. The next morning, while sipping coffee on the porch, the name came to him. It slid out like something half-remembered. Max. And Max stayed. Days didn't rush anymore. They settled in softly, like fog rolling down the hills. Elliot made his coffee each morning and sat outside while Max lay nearby, paws tucked, ears relaxed but always aware. They didn't need words. The silence carried everything. Their rhythm formed naturally. Walks to the general store, pauses at the creek to watch the water, afternoons spent chopping wood. Max followed not out of duty, but out of choice. A quiet loyalty. Elliot would tap, his leg twice at night, and Max would rise, stretch, then curl by the chair, letting out a sigh that filled the whole room. That sound, more than tail wags, more than barking, was Elliot's favorite. It meant safety. It meant home. Max had an intelligence that lived in the spaces between things. He knew when to approach, when to sit quietly, when to simply be. It wasn't training, it was trust. And with that trust, Elliot no longer felt alone. But one autumn afternoon, the silence broke differently. The sun lowered behind the ridge, light spilling gold across the trees. Elliot had meant only to gather firewood. Max stayed in the yard as he always did. But when Elliot returned, the gate was ajar. He didn't remember leaving it that way. "Max," he called. Steady. Firm. No answer. He whistled. 2 short notes. Still nothing. The gate creaked in the breeze. A weight sank into Elliot's chest, cold and heavy. Not panic, but the dread of something precious slipping quietly away. Then footsteps on gravel. His neighbor Carl crossed the road with a bag of apples in hand. "Saw something yesterday," Carl said, hesitating. "White SUV, out-of-state plates, man loading a dog into the back." Elliot's throat closed. Carl's voice dropped. Looked like Max. Tail was low. Eyes didn't look right. He didn't want to go. And just like that, the world went quiet again. Not the peaceful kind, the hollow kind. The next morning, Elliot printed the only photo he had of Max, taken on the porch, the dog half asleep in sunlight. He taped it to cardboard, wrote his number in thick black digits, and carried it from shop to shop. "Mind if I leave this here?" he asked. Some nodded, some just pointed to a wall. He taped them with duct tape, staples, thumbtacks, whatever he found. Posters went up like scattered pieces of himself. He carried copies folded in his coat pocket, handing them to mail carriers, delivery drivers, students, tourists, anyone. Every day he retraced the same roads, past the orchard fence, down by the dried creek, across the abandoned football field, always calling the same name, soft as a prayer. Max. but the tracks were long gone. Tire marks washed away. The trail erased. What Elliot didn't know, what he might never know, was that Max had been taken by someone who thought they were doing good. A man from out of town passing through had opened his car door and said, "I'll get you someplace warm, buddy." But the warmth was wrong. The smell wasn't right. The voice didn't match. Max didn't eat, didn't sleep, just stared out, the window in the direction they came from. On the third night, the man forgot to lock the side gate and Max ran. Not towards something, but away from everything that wasn't Elliot. Max didn't know where he was going. He just ran through backyards, over ditches, under fences. His paws hit gravel, then dirt, then pavement again. Every step carried him farther from what was unfamiliar, closer to something he couldn't name, but still remembered. He followed smells that reminded him of woodsome smoke, old boots, coffee grounds. None of them were right, but they were close, and close was enough to keep going. He slept behind dumpsters and under truck beds, wherever engines sticked with fading warmth. He learned which voices meant danger and which owns passed without stopping. He drank from puddles, dodged headlights, and limped when one of his paws began to swell. But he never stopped. Days blurred into nights. Nights blurred into weeks. No collar, no name tag, just the look in his eyes, tired, weary, searching. And Elliot, back in that quiet house, never stopped looking either. The food bowl stayed clean. Thebed in the corner remained untouched. Each morning he walked the same loops. Even after the flyers faded and curled from rain, people stopped asking. The glances turned from curious to pitying. Some suggested he move on. But how could he? Some absences are too loud to ignore, and some love refuses to accept goodbye. So the world kept turning, and Max kept walking, until one day he walked too far, too long, and finally collapsed by a gas station on the edge of a town neither of them had ever known. 7 years had passed, long enough for the posters to vanish from fences, long enough for neighbors to stop asking, long enough for most hearts to give up, but not Elliot's. He didn't talk about Max anymore. He didn't need to. The ache had become part of his breathing. He no longer searched, not out loud, but quietly his eyes still looked behind every hedge, across every street, into the eyes of every stray. So when a grainy photo popped up one afternoon on a regional shelter's website, Elliot almost didn't look twice until something in it held him. A German shepherd, older now, curled into the far corner of a kennel. His fur was patchy, legs stiff. There was no spark in his eyes, only distance. But Elliot didn't need a name tag to know that posture. The way he curled into himself, not hiding, but bracing. It wasn't just familiar, it was remembered, like something once torn from him, now resurfacing through pixels. He whispered, "Max?" into an empty room. Noon answered. The next morning had dressed with purpose. His shirt was wrinkled at the cuffs, but he buttoned it all the way. He caught the early bus. Every mile felt like a question. What if it's not him? What if it is? This shelter smelled like bleach and barking. A young woman met him at the front. Hess showed her the picture. She nodded softly. "He came in a few weeks ago," she said. "Doesn't let anyone touch him. Hasn't responded to anyone. He's shut down." They walked slowly, passing cage after cage. Dogs barked, tails wagged. But in the last kennel, silence. The dog inside didn't move. Elliot stepped closer. "Max," he said. And for the first time in 7 years, something in the dog shifted. The ride home was quiet. Elliot sat near the back of the bus, legs stiff, one hand resting lightly on the leash. Max lay at his feet, not sleeping, not alert, just there, breathing, slow and shallow. Every bump made his body flinch, just a little, but he didn't try to move. Elliot didn't speak. He didn't pet him. He just kept his hand close. Presence was enough. By the time they reached the old gravel road, the sky was folding into gold. The house stood just as they'd left it, peeling paint, a crooked gate, and the same porch swing Elliot hadn't used in years. He opened the gate slowly. "You can come in," he said softly, like he was inviting someone back into a story they'd once shared. Max paused, then crossed the threshold. Inside, the house hadn't changed much. The radio was off. The floors were swept. In the corner of the living room, a bed sat waiting, freshly washed, but faded by time. Max didn't wag his tail, didn't make a sound. He walked through the rooms like someone retracing dreams, sniffing every doorway, every wall, every piece of furniture. Nothing was exactly how he remembered, but nothing pushed him away. That night, Elliot placed a soft blanket near the stove and filled a shallow dish with warm broth. Max didn't touch it, but he didn't leave either. And then, without thinking, Elliot did what he used to do. 2 soft taps on his leg, a quiet whistle. Max lifted his head, looked, and slowly he stood. His steps were unsure, his legs stiff from years of wandering, but he crossed the room, laid down beside the armchair, let out a long, weary sigh. Elliot lowered his hand, rested it gently on the dog's neck. "So it really is you," he whispered. Max didn't respond. He didn't need to, because sometimes love returns in silence, not as it was, but as it needs to be. Not to start the story, but to finish it.